Good evening, Adepts. As children of silence, we dedicate ourselves to the ragged lore, that which is cold, that which is silent, that which is lost, and that which may yet return. We venerate the sun in rags, the Madad, and the Elegiast. Common students of winter are morticians, euthanasiasts, and others who work with the dead. An example is the coffin maker on the island of Brankrug, a tamer of trees, a worker of woods, a consigner of cadavers. Mr. Keel is but one of many who feel the influence of winter in their lives. Mastery of this principle is shown through silence and patience, with an unusual affinity for cold and frost. A significant theme with winter is the acceptance of loss, whether that be through the pragmatic and kindly methods of notables such as Violet, who gives unstintingly of her time to ease the pain of passing, or the encapsulating loss caused by an accumulation of dread, the wolf that devours thought. As the eternal patience of the Colonel always withstands the brutal strength of the Lionsmith, winter will subvert edge. Opposingly, after the end of all things in winter, new life will return in the new spring, and thus, heart subverts winter. Outside of this cycle, winter has ties to both Forge and Lantern as secondary aspects of its major hours. We should remember, as we continue, that all things are linked, as of course, all things must end and be still. We see winter represented in the Colonel, the Horned Axe, and the Wolf Divided also. The wolf is especially prominent in the White Law despite being a part of Edge's chorality, to the extent that the wolf words are held as one of the greatest occult secrets of the Ragged Law. When the forge is cold, and the glory is dark, and the wood is dust, perhaps the wolf divided will rest, but only until it can devour itself. This word almost expresses the divided one's hatred. This fragment speaks on the nature of the wolf divided, and can be further understood by understanding wolf stories through the lens of scholacosophy. But perhaps this is best left for now, to those who study the profane knowledge of scale, which holds nothing for us. Mastering the ways of stillness allows us to achieve true silence, to bring about the end of all of our foes, and even to weaponize feelings of dread, giving our foes something to think about every time they close their eyes. Though we must always be careful, as we share our powers with the worms of the world, which will seek to undo us as we seek to undo them. The Tantra of Worms explains various less than practical countermeasures against the worms. Moth and Winter are closest to them, and so understand their weaknesses, but both have their own perils. The Lionsmith crushes them, but that's not recommended for mortals. As the aspect to represent the ending of all things, we are granted mastery of the dead, being able to manipulate corpses into serving our purposes. Indeed, all rituals involving the raising of the dead require a winter influence. A significant difference with our Aligned Long is that whilst the key characteristic of a Long is their inability to age while retaining their susceptibility to other forms of harm, the inverse is true for Winter Long. A date is set for all, and nothing may bring about their end until this date occurs. Part of this is due to the fact that in order to ascend under winter, an adept must themselves die. The Elegiast calls each of the dead by name. Occasionally, for a great price, he will call one of the dead up out of nowhere, that they may continue, lonely, unscathed, until the date of their own final winter. To deepen our understanding of our dedications, we should first understand the hours that commemorate, grieve, and guide us to our ends. The Elegiast is the 9th hour. He commemorates and mourns, ensuring that we will never forget the hours which have been lost. Whilst the Elegiast is not a kind hour, he is similar to those such as the Watchman in that he is never cruel. As the hour primarily associated with memory and remembrance, the Elegiast is associated with many of those who too associate with such. The Ordo Limiae are one such group, later becoming the Obliviates, an order of Long associated with no hour, signing a contract with the Elegiast and drinking from the River Leith to forget such associations. These are the Long we hear of encountering within Port Noon. Members of the Ordo took an oath, the Ivory Chain, not to have commerce with the hours. Followed literally, this would be almost impossible for an adept, so the manual contains numerous clarifications, exceptions, and processes of indulgence. Our sibling church, the Towers of the Dove, explicitly venerates the Elegiast and expresses its devotion through the consumption of the deceased in order for their adepts to achieve ghoulhood. This is another form of immortality achievable by those of winter through memorialising the hours that have passed through. In service to remembrance, the Elegiast is the patron of institutions such as Hush House, the library on the Cornish Isle of Brankrug. In that vein, other followers of the Elegiast may consist of coffin makers, morticians and historians, all occupations concerned with conserving the memory of what has passed. The sun in rags is the 12th hour, a god from light representing the setting sun and its harrowing, glorious end. One of the 4 solar hours born from the sacrifice of the sun in splendour, the sun in rags was previously a name of the sun in splendour, alongside the Meniscate, though the rags influence can be strongly seen as far back as the Roman Emperor Elagabalus, who was known to have passed the White Door and suspected by Christopher Olopoli to have been an avatar of the sun in rags himself. Elagabalus was infamous to the point of his assassination for attempting to replace Jupiter as head of the Roman pantheon with a god he personally worshipped. This god was Elagabal, the Syrian sun god who was later assimilated with Sol, the Roman sun god, forming what is known as Sol Invictus, or the Unconquered Sun. The eponymous church that formed around the Unconquered Sun within the 3rd and 4th histories venerated the sun in splendour and his names, which would later become the solar hours. As the name implies, the sun in rags is heavily tied to the sun in splendour, and is in many ways a continuation of him. The rags is a strong representation of both lantern, being the merciless light in the sky, as well as winter, representing the fading light of sunset. Whilst the splendour ruled over the house of the sun in the Mansus, the rags only exists as a distant light, occasionally seen wandering alongside his silent retinue. He exists in an almost eternally mournful state. His most well-known sect of servants, the Maids in the Mirror, are champions of a famously bloody and painful test of the dead who are without mercy. It is believed that most of those who ascend to Long under the aspect of winter do so while serving the sun in rags. These Long are known as Raggies in the wider occult community. The Narnian sketches are travelogues and studies exchanged by Raggies and ghouls, that is, the Long who've ascended under the patronage of the sun in rags, and those who won the attention of the Elegiast, respectively. Finally, the Madrigad is the 14th hour, a god from light previously recognised by the Church of the Unconquered Sun as a name of the sun in splendour. She is the fragment of the splendour that represents the winter dawn, the cold, bright light that signifies the ending of autumn and the beginning of the winter season. She is heavily associated with death, being the guide for the recently deceased to enter the House of the Sun through the White Door. The cindered tally is also attributed to her, which is the source of the stolen years which are collected by the edge-aligned cult known as the Reckoners. Her creation occurred as a part of the division of the Sun, and this is represented by her forge aspect, as the division that occurs as a part of alchemical processes, or indeed the division that has caused the sun in splendour to be present in the multiple solar hours in the first place. While not primarily known as a winter hour, it is suitable to mention the Horned Axe. She holds the principles of Knock and Winter, and as a god from stone has no clear origin, being the only one who remains. She is significant, as she holds opposition to the principle of Edge, despite once being such, but this may in turn relate to Winter's subversion of Edge. This is partially due to her enjoyment of the separation of things, and Edge's overwhelmingly prevalent method of ascension relying on the dyad system of pairs. As previously mentioned, winter is the primary aspect of the worms of the world, which is what allows us to understand their weaknesses just as those who follow Moth can. Librarians of Hush House, amongst others, can invoke winter-aligned powers to end some of the curses associated with the worms. On expeditions where worms can be encountered, the Sun in Rags is invoked for his lantern light, which may shield disciples from the curse of the worms. Regarding worms, whilst we may understand the weaknesses of worms, we do not necessarily hold the strength to combat them. For that we must rely on those of Edge. The Worm Museum is guarded by the Colonel, who we understand for his stillness and patience, and the Lionsmith possesses strength enough to crush a worm with his bare hands. There are those who in fact worship the worms of the world, and perhaps desire for us all to return to nowhere. Do not be confused. Whilst we venerate the inevitability of death, it is not pursuant for us to seek this goal, for indeed there can be no more loss if everything else is already lost. As we briefly discussed earlier, while it does not appear to be the case that Long may ascend under the Elegiast, an alternate form of immortality known as ghoulhood is possible. This is done through acquiring memories of the dead through the cannibalization of corpses, all in the goal of creating an artifact known as the Palest Painting, which memorialises those hours which have passed into nowhere. Perhaps all those who cross into ghoulhood create their own versions of this painting. The elixir Zerboim is that formula which quickens the memories of decaying flesh in the bellies of the living. Such a thing could not exist without the consent of both the flower maker and the Elegiast, and with the assistance of one more hour besides. We're not sure of Ascension alongside the Madrigad, as the hour associated with the cindered tally, she certainly possesses power over people's lifespan. The Reckoners surely understand where their longevity and resilience comes from. Perhaps in this way they're a form of Winterlong despite their insistence on remaining independent from allegiance to any hour. Thank you for attending, Adepts. For more lore, feel free to join the library. Otherwise, please go forth and spread the ragged words, for despair comes for us all in the end.